The difference in blood vessels is a very common question asked in medical school exams, and it will serve you well to remember them. I am the ortho nerd, and let's dive in.
We have an artery, we have a vein. Those are two main categories of blood vessels, and they have three layers. So we have the tunica intima, which is the inner layer surrounding the lumen, the media, and the adventitia. Now the tunica media is the innermost layer of the blood vessel. It's single-celled usually and squamous epithelium, and the whole function is to reduce friction. So as you can imagine, red blood cells are quite thick, and they are the solid part of the blood, and they can cause friction. So 45% of the blood is cells, solid cells, so you want something to reduce the friction and line the vessel. Then we move on to the tunica media. So this varies in degrees of thickness. It's thicker in arteries and thinner in veins, and these are made up of smooth muscle. Now, the pressure of the blood that flows through it depends on the level of the contraction of the tunica media. And certain vessels have more of the muscles, and certain cells have less. And that's because of the different functions of different arteries, which we'll get to. It's a smooth muscle, so it responds to the sympathetic nervous system and hormones. If we vasoconstrict, so that means reduction in the radius, right? That's vasoconstriction. We increase pressure, and vice versa for vasodilation. We dilate, and therefore we decrease pressure. We also have some elastic tissue fibers, which can provide passive recoil, and in the case of that causes the pulse. And we also have some folds here within the veins, which cause these valves to form for unidirectional flow. Now the tunica externa is the outermost layer. It's fibrous connective tissue. It's very thick. It's a protective layer, and it ensures that the blood vessel has strength, which becomes important when you have aneurysms. So you want to, there's a lot of blood going very quickly, so you need to have a thick sort of supporting layer to ensure that the blood stays there. We also have something called the vasa vasorum, which are small blood vessels. So in very big arteries, the diameter is so big that you can't get blood perfusion on the tunica adventitia or tunica externa. Those two are interchangeable. So tunica adventitia or externa means the same thing. So you need blood vessels to go into the tunica adventitia to give the cells their blood supply. So you can have certain small blood vessels within large arteries. So we move on, and these are the different vessel types. So we have the large veins, elastic arteries, medium veins, muscular arteries, venules, arterioles, and all the way down to the capillaries. Now let's talk about arteries and arterioles. So their function is to provide blood away from the heart. So it's oxygenated blood from the heart to the peripheries. The only exception for an artery which does not carry oxygenated blood is the pulmonary artery. And the pulmonary vein carries oxygenated blood back to the heart. That's the only exception. Then we move on to the capillaries. So they are the sites of exchange of water, oxygen, nutrients. This is the as we go further down the level here, these become more numerous, right? So it becomes much more denser. So we have this dense network of capillaries and capillary beds, and they perfuse the tissues with blood. And you have this leakage through these capillaries, which is caused by hydrostatic pressures, and they produce interstitial fluid, and that drains to the lymphatic system. But what's important here is that they perfuse the cells and the tissues at the smallest level. Then we have our veins and venules, and they return oxygenated blood. The only exception is pulmonary veins. Now when we look at arteries, we have an elastic artery. And these are the big arteries. So these are very thick, major arteries. It's the direct branches from the aorta. They will be called elastic arteries. And the reason they're called elastic arteries is because they contain elastic tissue in the tunica media. So in the tunica media, they have elastic tissue. And this extra elasticity is required because you're so close to the heart. So when you have a strong contraction, it's a lot of force. It's a pump, right? A lot of force going through the blood vessels. You need this elastic sort of recoil to allow the blood vessel to stretch, and this is what causes the pulse. So you need the blood vessel to stretch and then come back to its place. If you didn't have the elastic tissue, then you would have permanent enlargement of the blood vessels. Now, as you get older, sometimes you can have fewer elastic tissues, or let's say you have a congenital deficiency where you do not produce this elastic parts. Well, then you can get a dilatation of your elastic arteries, which can cause all sorts of problems. Moving down, we have something called the muscular artery. And it's a very common type of artery. It's a distributing artery. So these are the arteries that you usually see branching off, right? So let's say you have a branch of the aorta, like an SMA, so the superior mesenteric artery, or the brachial artery will be a muscular artery. And the tunica media is much thicker, but the tunica externa is quite thin when you compare it to the elastic artery. And this is because the blood's been already going through this thick elastic arteries and it's getting distributed. So it doesn't need that extra protection. So tunica externa here is very thin. We move on to the arterial here. So the arterial is quite simple. It doesn't have a tunica externa. It's comprised of the tunica media, and it's usually 1 or 2 cells thick. So these are your arterioles, and these are the ones which constrict. So you have vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which changes the diameter. And as I said before, as we go down, lower into the smaller arterioles, they become more plentiful. So we increase the surface area, so to speak. So if the arterioles down there constrict, and a lot of them constrict at the same time, well, suddenly you have constriction, which changes the diameter and increases pressure. Do it the other way around, you have vasodilation, they dilate, and suddenly you have decreased blood pressure. So the arterioles are very important. They mediate the blood pressure here and the perfusion. Moving on to veins. So the large vein is your in the veins in general you have a thin media and a thick externa. And this thick externa is so that it allows it to be protected. You also have the folds within the tunica intima, which create the valves to allow unidirectional flow. And as you can see, the percentages, or like the relative thickness of the tunica externa to the media, is maintained. Then we go to the venules, where the tunica media is very thin, almost non-existent. And this is because if you have the muscle there, it's much more difficult to move the blood back to the heart. So venules, for example, or even smaller veins that are found in your foot and in your legs and in your lower limb, they are pumped by the action of the muscles. So it's the contraction of the soleus muscle in the leg which pumps the blood up. This is why people who are immobilized, they get pooling of blood and can get clots. So the fact that they don't have this muscular layer is so that you can actually squeeze them when your muscles contract, pushing the blood in one direction. And the valves sort of stay there to prevent backflow. So that's why the veins have quite thin media. Now we have capillaries. We have 3 different types of capillaries. Continuous and fenestrated ones are the most common. We also have sinusoids. So continuous capillaries, they permit very small solutes. They usually come from the arterial side. And they're found in every tissue except for epithelia and cartilage. You don't find them there. So cartilage and epithelia. Fenestrated tissues, so they have these pores. That's what it means. Fenestration means a window. It means a pore. And they allow larger components through. So these are your proteins. And the reason they have these pores is because they're incomplete linings. So they're not fully complete. And the endothelial cells, they have these gaps. Sinusoids, they're much more bigger and they allow free exchange of water and plasma proteins. And you can find these in the spleen. So this is a sort of simple diagram here. This question almost comes up every year, talking about the histology. And what do we see here? So we see that the first one here is the vein. So that would be the vein. And that's the artery. How do we know this? Quite simply, we have a thicker muscular layer here. So the staining here has stained the muscular quite clearly. This is probably hematoxylin staining. and we have the fibrous layer. So as you can see, the muscles are found within the intima, and the fibrous layer are found within the externa. Now here we see a much thinner and wider lumen, so that would be the vein, but sometimes certain arteries can look like this as well if they're squashed during the sampling. And as you can see, they're quite close together. The blue stuff would always be your fibrous tissue, so that would be your external layer. And if I can convince you that these small little layers here, if you can see them, small little layers there, those are your endothelium. And that in the middle, that's the lumen. So that's a vein and an artery, nice and simple. So right here we're looking at the different layers of the arteries and which blood vessel is this likely from. So we need to identify which is the inside and which is the outside. And as you can see, both ends are white. So which one would it be? Now, what we know about the tunica intima is that it's 1 cell thick, right? 1 cell thick. So it can't be C, it has to be A. So A is our intima, and that must mean that's our lumen, right? So that's our lumen, that's the inside. That's our intima. B is obviously our media because we have the muscles. And C is the tunica adventitia, or tunica externa. Now, what type of blood vessel is this? So it's likely to be an artery because of the thick muscular layer. But what type of artery? Now here we have to be a little bit speculative and sort of see that this tissue here is quite thick as well and a little bit disorganized. So we can see these little fibers which are sort of interchanged in between with the muscles. So if this was a muscular vessel, you would not have these white streaks. So these little white streaks would not be visible. This would not be visible. This would not be visible. Therefore, it has to have some sort of elastic tissue. And as we can also see, this is pretty thick. It's pretty big. So it has to be an elastic artery with a very thick tunica adventitia. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something. If you want to like and subscribe, it would be greatly appreciated.